This episode contains stories of emotional, physical, and mental abuse. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat 988lifeline.org. Welcome to the It's Your Story to Tell podcast, where brave people share how they overcome tough times to inspire others and what's possible. I'm your host, Megan Babcock, and I'm also the founder of the It's Your Story to Tell community and the Coach Collective. This is part 2 in a 3-part series where I am with nurse coach Tiffany, who was so awesome and vulnerable in sharing kind of her journey last week. So if you did not catch part 1, definitely I want to say go back so you can hear about what she has overcome and how her experiences have taught her so much and allow her to come alongside of others and help them do deep healing work. Today, we're going to be talking about the nervous system and how it is affected by trauma so that we can be able to assess whether or not we're really in a dangerous situation or if this is just unfamiliar territory for our brain, so that we can sit with that discomfort and then push through so that we can achieve the life that we really desire. So thank you, Tiffany, for coming on here and sharing your expertise with us. So let's just jump in. Let's talk about the nervous system and how it really responds to trauma.
Yes. Ooh, I love speaking about the nervous system. This has played such a tremendous role in my own healing and why I love bringing it to people. So, a lot of the times when we have experienced things in life, right? We hear this word trauma, right? This was me. I was like, no, like I didn't have trauma, right? I'm using
I
air
felt the
quotes
same
here.
way. Yes.
Yeah, I'm like,
I was like,
trauma?
now I look back and I'm like,
Oh,
oh
yeah.
my goodness, what world were you living in? You know, it was always
Yeah.
like dismissing. And I think that's part of our protection mechanism is like, no, I don't want to acknowledge that, or because that means I would have to actually do something with it. So
Yeah.
let's pretend
I
like it's not there. Disassociation. Like,
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of the times too, I know a big part of my story was I was also just so unaware of different, like what trauma even truly meant, right? When I used to think of trauma, background in ER nursing here. So it was like when I think of a traumatic event, I think of like this life altering event, like something really big that's like super identifiable for me. Like that
mhm.
was my perception of what trauma was. And so when I would see other people, I would be able to show them compassion and be like, yes, like, oh my gosh, I've not experienced that. But as I really begun to understand more things on like, what trauma truly is, and through a nervous system lens, my whole perception has really changed. And so when we can recognize that like trauma, it's not actually the event itself. It's
Mhm.
truly how our nervous system was able to handle whatever that scenario was at that moment in time. And so how that really landed within our system. And this is why sometimes you'll hear, well, like two people experienced the same thing, but the way that they handled it was so different. Right. And this is
Yeah.
all based off of our nervous system and our capacity to be able to handle certain things. This is directed by so many things. How we grew up. This is our
Mhm.
support system, our
Right.
community, right? There's so many different facets to it. And so as I really began to like understand this and recognize that like, oh, a lot of the things that affected me in past times were still showing up in the present, right? Because I had never
Mhm.
truly allowed myself to explore them, to get curious, I had no awareness around them, right? When we speak about me looking at this TikTok and being like, oh, you mean that there's more and there's this thing that was happening that maybe I wasn't able to identify before because of the state of my nervous system, right? When
Mhm.
we're speaking about the nervous system, there's this little thing, right? This little threat detector we have. It's called neuroception. And so basically, what it's doing at all times, every microsecond of the day, is it is checking our surroundings, right? So it is checking, is this safe? Is this dangerous? Or is this life threatening? And so it is constantly checking this out each and every moment that we experience throughout the day. And so what really begins to like influence how we determine what category this goes into is based off of our little filing system, right? I like to call it our little filing system that neuroception looks towards. And so basically what that means is when I'm experiencing something, our nervous system does not know time, right? This is why I would get so frustrated when I would hear like time heals all. And I'm like, well, why has it been 7 years
Mm.
and I'm still struggling with the same thing, right? Like, I've talked about it, I've expressed myself. There still was something very disconnected. And right when we're
Mhm.
speaking about things from like a nervous system standpoint, a somatic experiencing standpoint, it's really bringing the body on board. So a lot of the times when we're talking about things, we're using like cognitive, right? We're our thinking brain versus when we're doing things from like a nervous system perspective, a somatic experiencing perspective, it's a body-based modality. So it's a bottom-up approach. It's seeing and sensing into like what is showing up in my body, right? And so this is where sometimes when our little threat detector starts to have a response that maybe doesn't match what's showing up in the present moment, right? And
Mhm.
this is often because something feels familiar to the system. So basically, when I was speaking about that little filing cabinet, what happens is, say we have something that was presented to us, and I can speak to an example. So, an example is I had a past experience with my ex-partner where I wore this sparkly dress. Right? I wore this sparkly dress and I entered his car and glitter got everywhere. Right? And so in that moment, he freaked out. He
Mm.
screamed. I just cleaned this car, right? A lot of shame came over me, a lot of guilt. I felt awful, right? And so it really disrupted my nervous system. It went into this like protective mode, right? Of like, what's going to happen, right? And so I got quiet and I shut down. And so years later, right, I'm now with this really patient, kind person who's like never raised their voice at me. And I have a very similar experience, right? And so I get into his car and I have a glittery dress on and the glitter gets everywhere. And all of a sudden, what happens, right? Neuroception, that little threat detector, feels something familiar, right? And so it looks through my little filing cabinet and it pulls up a past experience and it says, ooh, remember the last time that this happened? Remember what happened? And this is all happening on a subconscious level,
Mhm.
right? Most of the times, this is happening so quick that we don't even recognize consciously what's happening. But it looks at this little reference and it says, do you remember what happened to you the last time this happened? And so within a micro moment, I am now hyperventilating, I'm shutting down, I'm crying, right? And now my
Mhm.
partner in this moment is looking at me and is like, what happened? Right? Like it wasn't matching what was currently going on in the present
Right.
moment. But my nervous system time traveled back to a moment that felt familiar. And so it exhibited this response, right? And so as we begin to become aware of this, right? Like in that moment, I was safe, but my nervous system loves me so much that it was willing to do anything in that moment to protect me, right? Which meant putting me into like a more disconnected state. You spoke about disassociating, right? Like
Mhm.
bringing me to a place to where it feels maybe a little bit safer for me to experience this moment, right?
Mhm.
And so what's so beautiful about our nervous system is we get to show it different, right? So it's all about, we cannot talk our way out of this. Have you ever had somebody try to like calm you down in that moment of like, it's okay? And you're like, it's
No,
not
it's
okay. Yeah. And so this is
not.
why talking your way through it, it doesn't work, right?
I'm
And it's this,
so glad you're bringing that up because I was really frustrated on my journey because I had spent so many years in counseling. And
Mhm,
actually, just talking about it was, I didn't realize, but it was just continuing to re traumatize me because
mhm,
I wasn't, you talk about processing it from a verbal standpoint is not helpful for trauma. It's like,
mhm,
yes, you have to be able to speak it out and recognize it, the awareness piece, but then you can't talk your way out of it. And that was when I ended up having a domestic abuse advocate who had walked the journey and who was trained in helping me to begin to get curious about this processing that's going on behind the scenes. Because, like we were talking about in episode 1, I would leave and I would come back because I believed something that was false. And so I had to be able to start getting curious to understand, where did that false narrative
mhm,
come from? Is that me? Is that my identity? No, it wasn't. It was the voice of somebody else that I was now interpreting as my own voice. And it was very directing me back to self and to understand, okay, when something rises up in your body,
mhm.
get curious, gain understanding. And I was like, that changed my life. I was like, oh my goodness. And then I started learning and getting certified and taking courses like Body Keeps the Score, where
Mhm.
they talk about talk therapy does not work for trauma. And I was like, oh, that makes total sense. And what you're talking about is exactly what this domestic abuse advocate was teaching me, and using mindfulness and all of that. And it was amazing how things started transforming so quickly when we took a different approach using this
Mhm.
modality. So I'm so
Yes.
glad you highlighted that, because if you are someone who's sitting there and you're like, I'm doing all the work
Yeah.
and I'm working so hard and I feel like I'm swimming against a current, it may
Mhm.
just be that the modality that you're using is not actually the best one for your experience.
Yeah. And this is where it's like this piece of exploration is so imperative and important because everybody is going to process differently, right? I think there's
Mhm.
definitely a time and place for incorporating like talk
Absolutely.
therapy,
Right.
but it's when we're not also bringing the body on board that things
Right.
can feel, like you said, feeling very stuck, very stagnant of like, why am I not able, right, to step towards this like new life, to feel differently within this
Mhm.
life that I'm experiencing, right? Like my experience was I'm remarried and I have two beautiful children and like, but why do I still feel so disconnected from the life that I'm living, right? And it's because my body
Yes.
was still experiencing and had all this feelings of being stuck in this past relationship that I was
Mhm.
trying so desperately to process. And so it really wasn't until I started to notice the sensations in my body. How
Mhm.
many of us, I say that we live in the head and we're like, wait, what? I have a body, right? I'll ask my clients, what is showing up? What happens if we slow down just 1%? And they start to recognize, oh my gosh, I'm wearing my shoulders as earrings. Oh my gosh, my heart is racing, right? So often we say, yeah, I'm good. I'm fine. And when we begin to
Mhm.
get curious of like, oh, okay, well what tells you that? Like how do you know? Right? What do you sense in your body? And we start to get curious of like, oh, my body, like I'm actually noticing that my feet want to move. Oh, interesting. Like, what happens if we
Mhm.
follow that impulse, right? It's really beginning to just explore the way that our body likes to speak, right? Because our body
Yeah.
speaks a different language. It doesn't speak in verbal terms, it speaks in showing us symptoms like discomfort, right? Pains in different parts of our body, our heartbeat
Tension.
racing.
Yeah.
Yeah, tension. It's the way that our body's speaking, but so often we discredit that and we're just like, oh, yeah, I've got like a pain in my shoulder. There's a random pain in my back and I must have just did something, right?
Mm,
We don't allow
right.
ourselves to get curious and to
Mhm.
explore what might be happening there.
Well, I think you made a good point too. Now I can go back into a counseling situation and not have my nervous system hijack me. So
Hmm.
I can engage in talk therapy,
Yeah.
but it's only because I recognize the triggers in my body and I can respond to them. Okay, what do I need in this moment?
Yes.
Because when I didn't know that, it was continuing to light my nervous system up. And
Hmm.
so then I was stuck in my lower brain. I couldn't even get to curiosity because we all
Yep.
know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you are in survival mode, you aren't
Yes.
even able to access
Hmm.
that higher level of conscious thinking. And so I think that's what's really powerful about learning to listen to your body and give it what it needs, because then you remain in a control state. Like, I know what my body needs, and you are offering yourself safety. You talked about was the first time you trusted yourself. So back in episode 1, what allowed you to stay away was for the first time you trusted yourself. You
Hmm.
gave your body safety,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
And
then
that's,
you were able to respond differently, right? I think that's
yes.
such a powerful example of moving into that greater level of safety so that you can even do the work that we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, and I love that you brought that up because that is what's imperative, like, when we are doing some of this work, like, when we're in a place that is truly unsafe, right? Like, we're truly in an unsafe space. We're maybe receiving that mental abuse, physical abuse, and we're not allowing ourselves to seek out support, to seek
Mhm.
out a safe enough space. It's very hard for, just like you said, for us to get curious, right? I It's often described as, think of like a tiger being just like a few hundred feet away from you. You don't have time to think and to get curious and to look
Are you
around.
hungry today? Like,
Yeah, we don't
when
have
was the last
time
time you
for that.
ate?
Yes, yeah, and so we have to move. But what often happens, right, what was my experience was I was no longer in this relationship. I was now in a safe
Mhm.
enough space, but my body didn't recognize that. I needed
Right.
to show it different, right? And
Mhm.
so it's that big piece of how we get to curiosity, what that looks like, and building our capacity to do so,
Yes.
because it's not that we never go into a heightened state or a disconnected state or a
Right.
disassociative state. Those are all that we want to be able to experience those things. That's what makes us the ability to have this human experience. It's just when we stay in those
Mhm.
places longer than we're supposed to. And a
Right.
lot of us are walking around in states that were maybe needed 30 minutes ago, but they're no longer required now.
That's so good. I I hope people are just really hearing how this is such a it is literally a journey, and it's this what's going on in my body, it's asking questions. And then I think the other piece that you said is like staying in your head. Um One of the things that I'm trained in design thinking, and it's just a problem solving framework. It's you can use it in so many different things but it's all about questioning and curiosity, and it challenges you to ask 5 questions.
Mm.
So you ask a question, what am I feeling? Angry. Oftentimes we just leave it at that, like you said. But if you said, okay, what's going on around me that makes me feel angry? How is my body feeling right now? What is
Mhm.
it telling me that I need? Is this going something going on right now that I need to respond to? Or is there something that's familiar from the past, right? And then we actually get to a root cause. And I think that's what is needed in order to move forward, because you're right, it's not the present day often that you are experiencing. It's a remembrance from the past. And so if you can't get to the past, you're symptom managing, right? That's like
Mhm.
putting a band-aid on it. That's stop the bleeding. Like you have to do that, right? You're an ER nurse. I was a critical care um, cardiac nurse, but like you have to respond to the emergency, but then you have to be able to get curious to understand why did that happen in the first place? Because
Mhm.
otherwise you're constantly in an emergency. You're constantly just having to respond versus
Yeah.
getting to the root of something, applying strategies to hopefully avoid that. And I love how you talked about trauma. I think it's so important. That was the whole idea for me when It's Your Story to Tell came to mind, is that I wanted people to see so many different stories so that they could say, oh, wow, I did go through something like that. And so that they could feel the permission to acknowledge their hard. Because a lot of times it's even things that you didn't even realize because you grew up in something that was normal for you, but it
Mhm.
wasn't maybe easy to go through. And by hearing someone else's story or like the TikTok you saw, you're like, huh, let me think about that. Like, wow, okay. And that just level of education and awareness allows you to start doing this work. But you have to be able to get curious about your body, because if you can't create a space of safety, then it makes it really difficult to get to the root cause.
Yeah. And always just bringing in that level of compassion, right? It's
Mm,
like I look back now at where my journey started, right? My past experiences, and I'm able to see them through such a different lens than I was able to see them through when I was younger, right? Because I was in more of a survival mode, where now I'm
mhm,
able to see, oh, my two parents were so dysregulated. They were trying to figure out their own journey. And I can have so much like empathy, sympathy for them and for my
mhm,
experiences at the same time, right? It's like we don't dismiss what we went through, but we're able to recognize of like, oh, I can look at it through such a different light. Even my past partner, of like, I can see things so differently and hold them in a such different light, which is what the goal is, right? So we can
mhm.
continue on in this journey versus holding on to some things that create more discomfort, and learning to let them go so we can take steps towards where we truly desire to end up.
Right. Well, I'm really excited for next week's episode where you are going to take me through an exercise and let our listeners have a look into kind of how you work with clients and how this works. And, we also at It's Your Story to Tell weekly do a guided mindfulness, and we have all different types of topics. So you'll be able to find something that can help support you in this discovery of what's going on in your body and helping you to be able to sit with it and get curious. So I just wanted to highlight that so you guys can check that out. They are on our YouTube channel, so you can get there through the website. Tiffany, tell us where listeners can find you, and then I will make sure it's in the show notes too. So
Yeah. Yes, I hang out mostly on Facebook. So you just type in Tiffany Homan. I also have a free Facebook group community where I love to go live. It is called Breaking Free with Tiffany Homan Coaching. And then I also am on Instagram, which is just Tiffany Homan Coaching as well.
amazing. Okay, you guys come back next week. Check out what somatic experiencing work looks like so you can have a better understanding. Share this with a friend. I know you know someone who is going through something hard, and this 3-part series is going to really help them to break through. I think it's something that we should be teaching in schools. My goodness, like I just look back, like if I had known this 20 years ago, even, what would my
Mhm.
life have looked like? So
Yeah.
do something good for the world and share this with your community. Thank you for being here with us, and we will see you next week.